To summarize Exodus in one sentence, we could say it is the frame through God's sovereignty. Look at the frame of the Old Testament. Please follow the sequence from ages, leaders, key places, national perspective, and authorities' perspective to the genealogy of Jesus, the book's allocation and their representative triplets, the spiritual perspective of prophets, and lastly, BC and Adam's Chronicle. Please open your Bibles to Exodus chapter 12, verse 14. Now the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. Since entering Egypt was in 2238 of the Adam Chronicle, the year they came out of Egypt was in 2668. Three pillars of Exodus. When I say Exodus, what comes to mind? Moses, Exodus, 10 plagues, Mount Sinai, 10 commandments, the laws, and the tabernacle. Major 7 topics. These are categorized into 3 pillars. Therefore, ECT is the representative mark of the book of Exodus. Let's take a look at the details. The Exodus, in other words, was the demonstration of God's power and Almighty. From a spiritual perspective, it was the fulfillment of Genesis in chapter 15, verse 16, saying, "In the 4th generation, your descendant will come back here." And Genesis chapter 15, verse 13, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years." This fulfillment began with the story of Moses' appearance, starting with his birth, then growth at the palace, his escape to Midian, and then the Lord's calling. The process of Exodus started with a series of plagues. These were natural disasters made by the Lord. But from a spiritual perspective, it was a judgment on Egyptian idols and instructions for the Israelites and Egyptians to know the Lord is God. The process ended with the death of the firstborns of Egyptians as well as their animals. It was on the Passover. God saved the firstborns of the Israelites. The 10 commandments and laws were God's sovereignty and the governing rule of the Israelites. And it was also an order of creation for God's kingdom on the earth. The order of creation between the Lord and the Israelites and among peoples. The tabernacle was the Lord's dwelling place on earth with us. Why did the Lord give it to us? Because he wanted to accompany the Israelites. So he separated it from worldly places and made it holy. He gave detailed instructions to build it after the one in heavens. He also designed the holy instruments of the tabernacle as well as the priest's clothes. Exodus chapter 34 verse 6 is the key verse because this is the only passage that introduces the Lord by himself in the Bible. The Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. This represents the 5 characteristics of the Lord. In addition, he also punishes people as stated in the following verse 7, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the fathers to the 3rd and 4th generation. Please realize that this is unchangeable. Even after Jesus came down for us, he forgave our sins but punishes us for them as well. We should be responsible for our sin even after we are forgiven by the Lord. Let's see the structure of the book of Exodus based on the major subject. The frame is divided into 4 topics: Moses, Exodus, Commandments, and Tabernacle. Through these episodes, we can look up to several spiritual models to live a saint's life. The story of Moses represents how the Lord calls his servant for his missionary. The exciting and miraculous Exodus story tells us what the Lord's providence is. Sometimes he hardens or softens our hearts. The Lord demonstrated his authority to us through the commandments and the laws, which were created by him. The Lord wanted to dwell amongst the Israelites because he loved them and showed his love to them through his presence at the tabernacle. His presence is his glory. Before going into detail with each story, let's first see the key people in it. Aaron was a key co-worker for Moses' missionary. Jethro was a good advisor to Moses in the desert. After the Exodus, the Lord inscribed the commandments on tablets of stone. Both Bezalel and Oholiab were key people in building the tabernacle as a designer and a trainer respectively. The Lord gave them wise hearts to complete their responsibilities. Let's take a look at a few key words representing each subject. For Moses, oppression on the Israelites by Egyptians, the burning bush as the Lord called him, and miraculous signs such as his staff and hands to convince him. For the Exodus, the itinerary from Egypt to Mount Sinai, God's miraculous incidents such as Red Sea, manna, quails, etc., and the victory to Amalekites. For commandments, laws, and decrees to support the commandments, moral and ritual decrees, and the feast of unleavened, the harvest, and the ingathering. For tabernacle, the Lord as a sovereign, his 5 characteristics, and a reward and punishment policy of him. Now let's break down each subject. For Moses' appearance, situations were arranged for his birth and was rescued by an Egyptian princess. He was adopted as her son and was brought up as a prince who was able to build the required skills and talents to lead the Israelites in the desert. This was the Lord's providence. It was very important that he was equipped with Israelite identification through his nanny, his biological mother. This was a part of his preparation before calling him. The Lord probably changed his personality as well. He seemed to be a hot-tempered person before leaving for the desert, but he became meek throughout the 40 years in the desert. When he was ready to perform his mission, the Lord called him and gave a detailed instruction about what to do and how to do it along with his elder brother Aaron. The Exodus procedure was a very well organized step-by-step and dramatis personae acted by the scenario as prepared by the Lord. The key phrase of the scenario was, "I am the Lord." This was for the Israelites as well as Egyptians to recognize and remember eternally. This was the very purpose of the 10 plagues on the Egyptians. From a spiritual point of view, each plague represented the destruction of an Egyptian god and Pharaoh's divinity. For the Israelite descendants' lesson, he organized festivals such as the Passover, the unleavened bread, and the ingathering, etc. When they arrived at Mount Sinai, the Lord descended upon them and gave his 10 commandments and the laws to establish the way to worship and obey him and the rule to live together in peace and love. This was an order of creation between the Lord and his people and between peoples as well. The Lord wanted to dwell among the Israelites to walk together with them. He gave the design of his house and instructions to build it. Although the Lord set up the order like this, the Israelites committed idolatry with the golden cow due to their ignorance. Those who engaged in this were killed by Levites. Because of this, Levites were appointed as priests by the Lord. This is the overview about the frame of the book of Exodus. Now let's look into the detailed information of each subject. A different view of Moses. Many people say that Moses is an anti-type of Jesus because his mission was to lead the Israelites from slavery to the promised land. Here, let's see a different side to Moses' story. To do this, allow me to summarize his life into 10 major incidents. Before we do this, let's first review who the chosen people were since Adam after restoring the order of creation. Adam, Noah, Abraham, David, Jesus. These were the chosen ones when the Lord made a new attempt due to people's serious disobedience. From this point of view, Moses' role was different because he was not chosen for a new initiative but for guiding the Israelites from one place to another. Keep this in mind. Let's review Moses' life starting with his birth. First, he was born in trouble with an Egyptian king ordering to kill all male-born children. Let's keep it simple and call it born in trouble. Second, he grew as a son of a princess with her love, growing up in mother's love. Third, after trouble with the Israelite, his spiritual brother, he escaped to Midian, his father-in-law's house. Fourth, he met his wife by a well, who was a shepherdess. Fifth, he helped her water ship. Sixth, after he left his father-in-law came to him and advised him, father-in-law's visit. Seventh, the Lord called him at the burning bush to start his missionary, God's calling. Eighth, he guided the Israelites to the promised land, leading people to a place. Ninth, he guided the Israelites from Egypt to Canaan. When I summarize them again in order, try to remind yourself of a person who has a similar incidents. Escaped to his father-in-law, met a shepherdess by a well, helped her water ship, father-in-law came running after him, born in trouble. Who is he? Yes, Jacob. Both Moses and Jacob's lives are almost identical, aren't they? God's calling with a ladder on his way to Haran, leading people to a place, Goshen. He reversely guided people from Canaan to Egypt, and he was used for fulfilling the Lord's covenant in terms of people, building people, the object, where? In Goshen. In the other way, Moses was used, tenth, he was used for fulfilling the Lord's covenant in terms of land and authority, building God's dwelling place and his authority for the subject. Please remember that the Lord is the subject and we are the object. About the 10 plagues, let's begin with a few questions. How many plagues did the Lord create? 10 plagues. Exodus 6 chapters from 7 to 12 cover them. It is 15% of the book of Exodus out of 40 chapters. How many kinds of people are there on earth? From a spiritual perspective, there are two kinds of people. One kind is the chosen, and the other kind is the unchosen. The Lord made this distinction and demonstrated it through the 10 plagues. Why did the Lord perform a series of plagues? Because he wanted the Egyptians and the Israelites to recognize that the Lord is God, and he hardens or softens people's heart through God's providence. It was to teach people who he was before completing God's kingdom on earth after preparing his people in Goshen. 9 plagues with using tools are divided into 3 groups in different colors. The first magicians were involved in these. They could imitate the first 2 miracles, but failed for the third and admitted God's power and disappeared. All the fishes and frogs in the Nile died. Net remained. Pay attention, the order began from water and water ground, then ground. What is next? Air. Flies came, and next, invisible ones, marine and boils, bacteria. These were the second. During the second, the Lord announced the distinction between people as stated in Exodus chapter 8 verse 23, livestock in Exodus chapter 9 verse 4. No death except livestock by marine in the 5th plague. The 5th plague was on livestock. The Lord made a distinction between even the Israelite and Egyptian livestock. In this case, the Lord set a time unlike the previous plagues as stated Exodus chapter 9 verse 5. Tomorrow the Lord will do this in the land. There is no record of a conversation between Moses and the Pharaoh. The Lord did it the next day in Exodus chapter 9 verse 6. It was probably because this plague was not directly on people, but on livestock, such as horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep, and goats. How did the Lord kill livestock? It was a terrible plague, as stated in verse 3 in NIV translation and a murrain in KJV. It was probably a murrain. This was probably against the gods of livestock, such as cow, camel, etc., bull. The 6th plague was on man and animals by festering boils. The process of making the boils was interesting. Moses took a handful of soot from a furnace and tossed it into the air, and it became fine dust over the whole land of Egypt. Then festering boils broke out on man and animals. It seemed like a kind of magic. Therefore, this plague is considered as nullifying gods of magic and healing. The third group, it related to environmental disasters such as hailstorm, locust, and darkness. The 7th plague was hailstorm on everything growing in the field. It was a distinction not between Israelites and Egyptians, but between those who fear and ignore the word of the Lord. It was the worst hailstorm that had ever fallen on Egypt from the day it was founded till that time, as stated in chapter 9, verse 19. In chapter 9, verse 16, the Lord explained why he raised the Pharaoh up, because he would show up his power and would proclaim his name in all earth. The 8th plague was locust on what remained of the field after the hail. By the east wind, the Lord brought locusts to the land, as stated in chapter 10, verse 13, and by the west wind brought them into the Red Sea, as stated in chapter 10, verse 19. Here again, the Lord explained to Moses why he was creating those plagues. It was because his people would know him. The 9th plague was darkness for 3 days over Egypt, except the place where the Israelites lived in. The darkness is the Hoshek in Hebrew, which is the same word in Genesis chapter 1 verse 2. In Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 to 4, the Lord created light at first, and separated from the darkness. Perhaps the Lord wanted to demonstrate the first day of creation, didn't he? The 10th plague was carried out by the Lord himself. He struck down all the firstborns of Egypt, as stated in chapter 12, verse 29. Finally, he declared that Pharaoh would let the Israelites go after this plague, as stated chapter 11, verse 1. This was a victory of the Lord, nullifying Pharaoh's divinity, and to show that God is real and true. And he instructed the Israelites on how to prepare the Passover, the unleavened bread, and take articles of silver and gold from Egyptians when they left Egypt. Pharaoh's reactions to these plagues remind us of our behaviors before the Lord. Usually we also do not react immediately like Abraham, and react like the Pharaoh, step by step. From a spiritual point of view, all these plagues related to the Egyptian gods. Through plagues the Lord nullified their divinity. We can look at that some common phrases the Lord hardened Pharaoh not to do. As stated in chapter 9, verse 14, there is no one like me in all the earth. Thank you for listening.